Welcome to
our channel.
Have you ever noticed that some of the most important things in life are often the things we don't talk about? Not because they are unimportant, but because they are difficult to discuss. Sometimes we see something happening around us, we feel something inside ourselves, or we recognize a problem in our lives, but we choose to ignore it for a while. We tell ourselves that it is not a big deal, that we will think about it later, or that things will probably change by themselves. But many times, those small things we avoid noticing are actually giving us important information about ourselves, our relationships, and the way we live.
I think that's a very human experience. Most people like to believe they are honest with themselves, but the truth is that everyone has moments when they avoid certain realities. It doesn't mean people are dishonest. Often, avoidance comes from a very natural place. We avoid things because we want to protect ourselves. We want to avoid disappointment, embarrassment, conflict, or uncertainty. The interesting question is not whether we avoid things, because everyone does. The interesting question is why we avoid them, and what happens when we finally decide to pay attention.
Exactly, and I think this topic connects with almost every part of daily life. It connects with friendships, family relationships, careers, learning languages, personal growth, and even the way we see ourselves. There are many moments when we already know something deep down, but we are not ready to admit it. Maybe we know we need to change a habit. Maybe we know we need to have an honest conversation with someone. Maybe we know we are afraid of something, but we call it by another name because admitting fear feels uncomfortable.
That is such an interesting point. Sometimes people don't actually ignore information. They simply rename it. Someone might say, "I'm too busy to learn English." But the deeper reason might be that they feel nervous about making mistakes. Someone might say, "I don't care about that opportunity," but maybe they are afraid of failing. Someone might say, "I prefer being alone," but sometimes they are actually protecting themselves from the possibility of rejection.
Yes, and understanding that difference can completely change the way we approach our lives. Because if we only look at the surface, we may try to solve the wrong problem. We might think we need better time management, when actually we need more confidence. We might think we need more information, when actually we need the courage to make a decision. We might think we need a perfect plan, when actually we just need to take the first step.
I think this happens a lot when people learn English. Many learners believe their biggest problem is vocabulary or grammar. Of course, those things matter, but sometimes the biggest barrier is psychological. They know enough to start speaking, but they are afraid of being judged. They understand many words, but they don't trust themselves enough to use them.
That's so true. A person can spend years studying English and still hesitate when they have a chance to speak. The reason is not always a lack of knowledge. Sometimes it is the fear of showing what they don't know. Speaking another language requires accepting that you may not sound exactly like yourself at first. You may not be as funny, as quick, or as confident as you are in your first language.
And that can be frustrating because language is closely connected to identity. When we speak our native language, we have access to our full personality. We know how to express humor, emotions, opinions, and complicated ideas. But when we use another language, we may feel like we have become a simpler version of ourselves.
But that is only a temporary stage. It doesn't mean the person has become less intelligent or less interesting. It only means they are building a new way to express who they already are. I think this is something many learners need to remind themselves of. A person who is learning English is not becoming a different person. They are expanding their ability to communicate.
I really like that idea because it changes the way we think about mistakes. Many people see mistakes as evidence that they are not good enough. But mistakes are actually evidence that they are trying something beyond their current comfort zone.
Exactly. A person who never makes mistakes may simply be staying in a very safe area. Growth usually requires moments when we feel uncertain. Whether it is learning a language, starting a new job, building relationships, or developing a skill, there is always a period where we feel like beginners.
And many adults struggle with being beginners. Children usually have permission to be bad at something when they start. Nobody expects a child to speak perfectly when learning a new language. Nobody expects a child to play an instrument perfectly after one lesson. But adults often expect immediate results.
Yes, adults often say things like, "I should already know this," or "I am too old to start." But those thoughts usually come from comparison. We compare our beginning with someone else's experience after years of practice. We see someone who is successful today, but we forget that they also had a beginning.
That's one of the biggest things people pretend not to notice. Everyone has a learning process, we just don't always see it. We see the confident speaker, but not the years of practice. We see the successful professional, but not the mistakes behind the success. We see the finished product, but not the unfinished stages.
And because we don't see those hidden stages, we sometimes feel like we are the only ones struggling. We think everyone else understands life better than we do. But most people are also figuring things out as they go.
I think realizing that can be very freeing. It reminds us that confidence does not mean someone has no doubts. Confidence often means someone has learned how to continue even when doubts exist.
That's a really important distinction. Many people wait to feel completely confident before they act. But confidence usually comes after action, not before. You become confident because you practice, because you experience challenges, and because you discover that you can handle situations you once feared.
This is also true in communication. Many people want to become better communicators, but they focus too much on finding perfect words. They think a great communicator is someone who always knows exactly what to say.
But real communication is not about perfection. It is about connection. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations are not the ones with the most impressive words. They are the ones where people feel heard and understood.
And that brings us to another thing people often pretend not to notice: how much everyone wants to feel understood.
Yes, I think this is one of the strongest human needs. People want to feel that someone sees them, listens to them, and recognizes their experiences. But many people are afraid to express that need because it feels vulnerable.
They want support, but they don't want to ask for it.
Exactly. They want people to know how they feel without having to explain. But other people cannot read our minds. Sometimes the conversations we avoid are the conversations that could improve our relationships the most.
And that is where communication becomes difficult. Because honesty creates possibility, but it also creates risk.
Right. If you tell someone how you really feel, they may understand you better. But there is also a chance they may not respond the way you hope. And that uncertainty is why many people stay silent.
But silence also has a cost.
It does. Unspoken feelings don't always disappear. Sometimes they become distance, frustration, or misunderstanding.
A small problem that is never discussed can become a much bigger problem later.
Exactly. And that is why noticing things early is so important. Noticing does not mean judging. It simply means being aware.
Being aware of ourselves, other people, and the situations around us.
And sometimes awareness begins with a simple question: what am I avoiding?
That is a powerful question.
Because the answer can reveal a lot.
I think that question, what am I avoiding, can be surprisingly difficult because many people are very good at explaining their behavior in ways that feel comfortable. We create logical reasons for our choices, and sometimes those reasons are true, but sometimes they only represent part of the story. The deeper reason may be something we don't want to face.
Yes, and I think this happens because the human mind naturally tries to protect us. If something creates emotional discomfort, our first reaction is often to move away from it. We avoid situations that make us feel embarrassed. We avoid conversations that might create conflict. We avoid decisions that might lead to failure. In the short term, avoidance can make us feel better because we remove the uncomfortable feeling. But in the long term, the thing we avoid often stays there.
That's such an important point. Avoidance is interesting because it works temporarily. If you don't practice speaking English today because you feel nervous, you may feel relieved for a few hours. If you don't have a difficult conversation with someone, you may feel more comfortable that day. If you don't make a decision about your future, you may avoid uncertainty for a little longer. But eventually, the same situation returns.
Exactly. And sometimes it returns with more pressure. A small conversation becomes a bigger conversation. A small fear becomes a stronger fear. A small habit becomes a pattern. This is why paying attention to small signs is so valuable. Many major changes in life begin with small moments that we almost ignore.
I think relationships are a great example of this. Most relationships don't suddenly become distant overnight. Usually there are small changes first. People communicate less. They stop sharing certain things. They become less curious about each other's lives. These small changes are easy to ignore because there is no dramatic moment.
Yes, and because there is no dramatic moment, people often tell themselves everything is fine. They think, we're just busy, or things will probably return to normal. Sometimes that is true. Life becomes busy, and people naturally go through different periods. But sometimes the distance is a signal that something needs attention.
The difficult part is knowing the difference.
Exactly, because we don't want to overreact. Not every quiet moment means there is a problem. Not every change means a relationship is ending. Good communication requires balance. We need to be aware, but we also need to avoid creating problems that don't exist.
That's a very important skill. Many people struggle with either ignoring everything or analyzing everything. They either pretend nothing is happening, or they search for hidden meanings in every small action.
Yes, both extremes can create problems. If we ignore everything, we may miss important signals. If we overanalyze everything, we may create unnecessary stress. The goal is thoughtful awareness.
I like that phrase because it suggests curiosity instead of judgment. Instead of immediately thinking, something is wrong, we can think, I wonder what is happening here.
Exactly. Curiosity creates space for understanding. Judgment closes that space quickly.
And this is especially useful when communicating with people from different backgrounds. Cultural differences can create many situations where people misunderstand each other.
Absolutely. When we meet someone with a different communication style, we often interpret their behavior through our own expectations. We assume our way of showing respect, interest, or friendliness is universal.
But it isn't.
Right. For example, some people show friendliness by asking many questions. They want to know about your family, your experiences, and your opinions because they are interested in you. But someone from another background might see those questions as too personal.
Or the opposite can happen. Someone may be quieter because they want to be respectful and give others space, but another person may interpret that silence as a lack of interest.
Exactly. The behavior is the same, but the meaning changes depending on the person's perspective.
This is why learning a language is also learning a way of seeing the world.
Yes, a language is not just a collection of words and grammar rules. It carries habits, values, and ways of interacting. When you learn English, you are also learning how many English speakers organize conversations, express opinions, show agreement, and build relationships.
And that can be one of the most interesting parts of language learning.
Definitely. Many learners focus on memorizing vocabulary lists, and vocabulary is important, but real communication happens between the words. It happens in the timing, the tone, and the relationship.
For example, knowing the sentence, I disagree, is useful. But knowing when to say it and how to say it naturally is a different skill.
Exactly. In many situations, a direct I disagree may sound stronger than you intend. You might choose something softer like, I see your point, but I have a slightly different perspective.
And that small difference can completely change the feeling of the conversation.
Yes, because communication is not only about being correct, it is about being effective.
That's a very important idea for language learners. Sometimes they worry so much about grammatical accuracy that they forget the purpose of language.
The purpose is connection.
Exactly.
A person who makes a small grammar mistake, but communicates warmly, can often create a better conversation than someone who speaks perfectly, but creates distance.
That doesn't mean grammar is unimportant.
Of course not, accuracy matters, but communication has many layers.
And one of those layers is confidence.
Yes, confidence changes the way people receive your message. When someone speaks with willingness and openness, listeners usually focus more on the meaning than the mistakes.
This is why confidence is not just a personal quality. It is also a communication tool.
I agree, and confidence often develops through experience. The more situations you experience, the more evidence you collect that you can handle them.
It's almost like building trust with yourself.
That's a great way to describe it. Every time you do something uncomfortable and survive it, you teach yourself, I can handle difficult situations.
And that lesson becomes valuable in many areas of life.
Exactly. A person who learns to speak a new language despite fear may become more willing to try other new things. A person who learns to have difficult conversations may become better at handling challenges in general.
Because the skill is not only about the specific situation. It is about learning how to face uncertainty.
Yes, and uncertainty is something nobody can completely avoid.
That's probably one of the biggest things people pretend not to notice. They want a life with no uncertainty, but uncertainty is part of being human.
Absolutely. We want guarantees before we make decisions. We want to know the result before we start. We want confidence before we take action.
But life rarely works that way.
No, most meaningful things require stepping forward without complete information.
Starting a relationship,
Changing careers.
moving to a new place,
Learning a language.
sharing an idea.
All of these require some level of uncertainty.
And that is why courage is not the absence of fear.
Exactly. Courage is moving forward while fear is present.
I think many people misunderstand confident people because they assume confidence means feeling comfortable all the time.
But confident people often feel uncomfortable too. They simply have experience managing that feeling.
They have learned that discomfort is temporary.
And that avoiding everything uncomfortable can create a much smaller life.
That's a powerful thought.
Because comfort is not always the same as happiness. Sometimes comfort keeps us in situations that no longer help us grow.
A familiar routine can feel safe, even if it is limiting.
Exactly, and noticing that requires honesty.
Which brings us back again to awareness.
Yes, the ability to notice what is happening inside and around us.
Noticing when we are afraid.
Noticing when we are avoiding something.
Noticing when someone needs support.
Noticing when a relationship needs attention.
Noticing when we have already made progress.
All of these things are easy to miss because daily life moves quickly.
And sometimes the most important moments are quiet ones.
A quiet feeling.
A small change.
A simple conversation.
A decision we keep postponing.
These moments may not seem important at first.
But they often shape the direction of our lives.
I think another reason people ignore important things is that modern life gives us so many distractions. We are surrounded by information, entertainment, and constant communication. But sometimes having more things to pay attention to actually makes it harder to notice what truly matters.
That's very true. We have more ways to connect than ever before, but many people also feel more disconnected. We can receive hundreds of messages, see thousands of updates, and consume endless content every day, yet still feel that something important is missing.
Yes, because connection is not created by the amount of information we receive. It is created by the quality of attention we give. A person can spend hours online and still not have one meaningful conversation.
That's such an interesting difference. We often confuse being informed with being connected. But knowing what is happening in many people's lives does not necessarily mean we understand those people.
Exactly. Understanding requires time and attention. It requires slowing down enough to notice details. It requires being interested in someone's thoughts, not just their updates.
I think this is one reason many people feel lonely today. They are not necessarily surrounded by fewer people. They may actually interact with more people than previous generations. But many interactions are brief and incomplete.
Right. A quick message, a short comment, or a reaction online can create a small moment of contact, but deeper connection usually requires more. It requires conversations where people feel comfortable sharing more than just the surface.
And sharing more requires trust.
Yes, trust is something that develops slowly. It is built through repeated experiences where people feel respected, listened to, and accepted.
Which is interesting because many people want deep relationships, but avoid the actions that create them.
Exactly. They want others to understand them, but they don't always make themselves available to be understood. They want close friendships, but they avoid showing vulnerability.
Because vulnerability feels like a risk.
Yes, when you share something personal, you are giving someone the opportunity to understand you, but you are also giving them the possibility of disappointing you.
And many people would rather avoid that possibility.
But avoiding vulnerability also creates distance. If we never show people who we really are, they can only connect with the version of us that we present.
That's a very important point. A person can be surrounded by people who know their name, their job, and their daily activities, but still feel unknown.
Because being known is different from being recognized.
I like that difference.
Being recognized means someone knows information about you. Being known means someone understands something about your experience.
And that deeper understanding takes time.
Yes, it requires conversations that go beyond simple topics.
Which is why good conversations are such an important skill.
Absolutely. Many people think conversation is just about speaking, but good conversation is a balance between expressing and receiving.
You need to share your thoughts, but you also need to create space for others.
Exactly. A conversation is not a performance where one person tries to impress another person. It is a shared experience.
I think this is another area where English learners sometimes struggle. They focus so much on producing language that they forget the importance of listening.
Yes, some learners think improving English means learning more complicated sentences, but becoming a better listener can improve communication just as much.
Because listening helps you understand how language is actually used.
Exactly. When you listen carefully, you notice expressions, sentence patterns, pronunciation, and emotional meaning.
You also learn how people respond naturally.
Right, textbooks can teach you correct sentences, but conversations teach you human communication.
For example, a textbook might teach a formal question, but real conversations show you how people actually start discussions, change topics, or express reactions.
And those small details make language feel natural.
I think this is why immersion is so valuable. The more you expose yourself to real conversations, the more you develop an instinct for the language.
Yes, you begin to recognize what sounds natural, even before you can explain the grammar behind it.
And that process requires patience.
A lot of patience.
Because language development is not always obvious.
Exactly. Sometimes you are improving without noticing. Your listening becomes better. Your pronunciation becomes clearer. Your understanding becomes faster. But because the changes are gradual, you may not recognize them.
Which connects to another thing people often fail to notice: progress that happens slowly.
Yes, many people expect transformation to be dramatic. They imagine one day they will suddenly become fluent, confident, or successful.
But most improvement happens quietly.
A little practice today.
A small improvement tomorrow.
A better habit next week.
A new ability after months of consistency.
The final result may look impressive, but the process is usually ordinary.
That is something worth remembering.
Because people often underestimate ordinary actions.
They think only big decisions change their lives.
But small daily choices often have a stronger effect.
The way we spend our time.
The conversations we choose to have.
The skills we practice.
The thoughts we repeat.
These things slowly shape who we become.
And because the change is slow, we sometimes don't notice it until much later.
Like looking back at old photos and realizing how much has changed.
Or hearing yourself speak a language you once struggled with.
Or realizing you handle situations that used to overwhelm you.
Those moments can be surprising because the person we become is created gradually.
I think that is why reflection is so important.
Yes, reflection allows us to notice what daily life hides.
It helps us connect the past, present, and future.
We can see where we started.
Where we are now.
And where we want to go.
Without reflection, people can move through life without understanding their own journey.
Exactly. They are always focused on the next task, the next goal, or the next problem.
And they never pause to recognize what they have already experienced.
Which can make life feel like an endless list of things to complete.
Rather than a collection of moments to experience.
That's a very important difference.
Because achievement is only one part of life.
Yes, growth, relationships, memories, and experiences matter too.
Sometimes people are so focused on reaching a destination that they forget to notice the journey.
And the journey is where most of life actually happens.
I think this applies strongly to career success too.
Definitely. Many people believe they will finally be satisfied after reaching a certain position or earning a certain amount of money.
But then they reach that goal and discover that happiness is more complicated.
Exactly. Achievements can create satisfaction, but they cannot solve every emotional need.
Because humans need more than external success.
We need meaning.
We need connection.
We need a sense that what we do matters.
And sometimes people pretend not to notice when their goals no longer match their values.
That's a very interesting point.
Someone may spend years chasing a goal because it once mattered to them, but people change. Their priorities change. Their understanding of themselves changes.
And admitting that can be difficult because it means accepting that the path needs adjustment.
People sometimes think changing direction means failure.
But sometimes changing direction means growth.
Exactly. a person is allowed to learn new things about themselves.
They are allowed to say, "This was important to me before, but something different matters now."
That requires honesty,
And courage.
because other people may not immediately understand.
But living according to other people's expectations can create a different kind of problem.
You may appear successful from the outside, while feeling disconnected on the inside.
And that is another thing people often pretend not to notice.
The difference between looking successful and feeling fulfilled.
Exactly.
I think that difference between looking successful and feeling fulfilled is something many people struggle with, especially because society often gives us very clear images of what success should look like. We are often told that success means having a certain career, earning a certain amount of money, owning certain things, or reaching certain milestones at a certain age.
Yes, and there is nothing wrong with wanting those things. Goals and achievements can be meaningful. The problem happens when people never stop to ask whether those goals actually belong to them or whether they are simply following a definition of success created by someone else.
That's a very important question. Sometimes people spend years working towards something because they believe they are supposed to want it. But when they finally get closer to that goal, they realize they never really asked themselves why it mattered.
Exactly. They were focused on reaching the destination, but they never checked whether it was the right destination.
And that can be a difficult realization, because it creates a conflict between expectation and reality.
Yes, a person may think, "I have achieved what many people consider successful, so why don't I feel satisfied?" And that question can be uncomfortable because it challenges the story they have been telling themselves for years.
But sometimes uncomfortable questions are the most valuable ones.
Absolutely. A difficult question can open the door to a more honest answer.
I think many people avoid these questions because they are afraid of what they might discover.
Yes, because once you notice something clearly, you have a choice. You can continue the same way, or you can make changes. And making changes requires energy, courage, and sometimes patience from the people around you.
This is why awareness can feel both powerful and challenging.
Exactly. Awareness gives you freedom, but it also gives you responsibility.
That's a great way to describe it.
Before you notice something, you can simply say, "I didn't realize." But after you notice it, you have more information. You have the opportunity to respond differently.
And that applies to learning as well. Many people know what they need to do to improve their English, but knowing is different from doing.
Yes, someone may know that practicing speaking will help them improve, but they still avoid speaking because it feels uncomfortable. Someone may know that listening every day is useful, but they choose easier activities because progress feels slow.
The gap between knowledge and action is something almost everyone experiences.
Exactly. We often think the problem is that we don't know enough. But sometimes the problem is that we already know enough to start, and we are waiting for a feeling of confidence that may only come after we begin.
That's such an important lesson.
Because confidence is usually the result of action, not the requirement for action.
You don't become confident and then practice. You practice, and through practice, confidence grows.
Exactly.
I think this is also true when people try to improve their communication skills. Many people believe good communication is something you either naturally have or you don't.
But communication is a skill. It can be developed.
Yes, a person can learn how to listen better, how to express ideas more clearly, how to handle disagreements, and how to make conversations more comfortable.
And one of the first steps is noticing our own habits.
Such as,
For example, do we interrupt people because we are excited to share our thoughts? Do we avoid asking questions because we are worried about seeming curious? Do we always try to give advice instead of simply listening?
those are very common habits.
Yes, and most people don't do these things because they don't care. They do them automatically.
Which is why awareness matters.
Exactly. When we notice a habit, we create the possibility of changing it.
I think one of the hardest things to notice about ourselves is our emotional patterns.
That's a very interesting topic.
For example, some people always become defensive when they receive criticism. They immediately explain why they did something or why the other person is wrong.
Yes, and sometimes the criticism may not even be a personal attack. It may simply be information that could help them improve.
But because the brain interprets criticism as a threat, the person reacts before they think.
Exactly. This happens to everyone sometimes. The challenge is learning to create a small space between receiving information and reacting.
A pause.
Yes, a moment where you can ask yourself, is this something I can learn from?
That pause can completely change communication.
Absolutely, because when people feel attacked, they usually protect themselves. But when they feel safe, they are more open to understanding.
Which means the way we communicate feedback matters too.
Definitely. Good communication is not only about what we say, it is also about how we say it.
The same message can create completely different reactions, depending on the delivery.
Exactly. Compare these two sentences. You always make mistakes, and I noticed this part could be improved. Let's look at it together.
The information may be similar, but the emotional impact is completely different.
Yes, one creates defensiveness, the other creates cooperation.
And this is useful in every relationship.
Family,
Friendships,
workplaces,
learning environments.
everywhere people interact.
I think many conflicts happen because people focus on proving they are right instead of trying to understand what is happening.
That's very true. Being right and being connected are not always the same thing.
Sometimes winning an argument damages a relationship.
Exactly. There are moments when the most valuable response is not proving your point, but understanding the other person's perspective.
That doesn't mean you have to agree with everything.
Right, understanding is not the same as agreement.
You can understand why someone thinks differently without accepting their conclusion,
And that ability is a sign of emotional maturity,
because it requires you to step outside your own viewpoint.
which is difficult because our own experiences feel so obvious to us.
We naturally see the world through our own history,
Our own culture,
our own fears,
our own expectations.
and we sometimes forget that other people have completely different experiences shaping their thoughts.
Exactly. This is another thing we often fail to notice. We assume other people see situations the way we do.
But they don't.
And that is normal.
Actually, that difference is what makes human interaction interesting.
Yes, if everyone thought exactly the same way, communication would be much simpler, but we would also lose creativity and different perspectives.
The challenge is learning how to communicate across those differences.
And that skill becomes even more important in a world where people from different backgrounds interact every day.
Which brings us back to language learning.
Yes, learning English is not only about communicating with people who are similar to us. It often means connecting with people who have different experiences, cultures, and ways of thinking.
And that is one of the most rewarding parts of learning a language.
You begin to discover that there are many ways to express ideas, solve problems, and understand life.
A new language doesn't just give you new words.
It gives you a new perspective.
And maybe that is something many learners don't notice at the beginning.
They start learning because they want better opportunities, but along the way, they discover a different way of connecting with the world.
That's the hidden value of language.
It changes not only how you speak, but sometimes how you think. I think one of the most meaningful things about learning a language is that it teaches us patience with ourselves. In many areas of life, we expect quick results. We want immediate improvement, immediate understanding, and immediate confidence. But language reminds us that some things grow slowly.
That's true, you cannot force yourself to become fluent overnight. You can study intensely for a short period, but real ability comes from consistent exposure, practice, and time. The same principle applies to many things in life.
Yes, relationships, careers, personal growth, and confidence all develop in similar ways. They are built through small actions repeated over time.
But people often overlook small actions because they don't feel dramatic enough.
Exactly. A person might think, reading 10 pages today won't change anything. Practicing speaking for 15 minutes won't make a difference. Having one honest conversation won't solve everything. But these small actions are not meant to completely change your life in one moment. They are meant to create direction.
That's a great way to look at it. Small actions create movement.
Yes, and movement matters because many people become stuck when they focus only on the final result. They look at a big goal and feel overwhelmed.
Like someone who wants to become fluent in English, but thinks about thousands of words they don't know.
Exactly. Or someone who wants to improve their communication skills, but thinks about every mistake they have ever made.
The distance feels impossible when you only look at the destination.
But if you focus on the next step, the process becomes more manageable.
One conversation,
One practice session.
One new expression.
One moment of courage.
Over time, these moments create change.
I think this is also connected to how people talk to themselves.
That's an interesting topic.
Many people are much harsher toward themselves than they would be toward anyone else. They make one mistake and immediately criticize themselves. But if a friend made the same mistake, they would probably respond with understanding.
That's very true. We often give others patience that we refuse to give ourselves.
And this affects learning. A person who constantly tells themselves they are not good enough may lose motivation. They may stop trying because every mistake feels like proof that they cannot improve.
While someone with a more supportive inner voice is more likely to continue.
Exactly. Self-compassion does not mean ignoring problems. It means creating an environment where improvement is possible.
That's an important difference, because constant criticism can make people afraid to take action.
Yes, and fear often leads back to the same pattern, avoiding things we need to face.
So the way we speak to ourselves can influence what we are willing to do.
Absolutely.
I think this is especially important for people who are learning English as adults.
Definitely. Many adult learners carry frustration because they compare themselves with younger learners or fluent speakers.
They think I started too late.
Or, I will never sound natural.
Or I should have learned this years ago.
But those thoughts focus on the past, and the past cannot be changed. The more useful question is, what can I do from this moment forward?
That's a much more empowering question.
Yes, because every learner has a different journey. Someone may start at 15, someone may start at 35, someone may start at 60. The important thing is not when the journey begins. The important thing is whether the person continues.
I love that idea because it removes unnecessary comparison.
Exactly. Comparison often makes people ignore their own progress.
They look at someone ahead of them and forget to notice how far they have already come.
Yes, imagine climbing a mountain and only looking at the people near the top. You might feel like you are failing because you are not there yet. But if you look behind you, you may realize how much distance you have already covered.
That's a powerful image.
And I think life is similar. We need moments where we look back and recognize our own growth.
Not to become satisfied and stop improving.
Right, but to appreciate the journey.
Because appreciation creates energy.
Exactly. People often think motivation comes only from wanting something better. But motivation also comes from recognizing what is already better.
That is a very important point.
If you never appreciate your progress, improvement can feel like an endless struggle.
You are always chasing something you don't have.
Yes, and you forget to value what you have already built.
I think this applies to relationships too.
Absolutely.
Sometimes people focus so much on what others are not doing that they forget to notice what others are doing.
Yes, a partner, friend, or family member may show care in many small ways, but because those actions are expected, people stop noticing them.
Until they are gone.
Exactly. Appreciation keeps relationships alive because it reminds people that their efforts are seen.
And everyone wants to feel seen.
Yes, that idea connects many things we have discussed today.
Learning,
Communication,
relationships,
personal growth,
they all involve noticing.
noticing what is happening around us,
Noticing what is happening inside us.
noticing the people who matter.
And noticing the opportunities we might otherwise miss.
I think one of the biggest lessons is that awareness is not about becoming perfect. It is not about analyzing every moment of life or finding problems everywhere.
Right, it is about being present.
Exactly, being present enough to recognize what deserves attention.
Because not everything deserves our attention.
That's true, there are endless distractions, endless opinions, endless information.
But only some things truly matter.
And learning to identify those things is a skill.
A skill that improves with practice.
Just like language,
Just like communication.
just like anything meaningful in life.
I think maybe the reason people pretend not to notice certain things is because noticing creates a responsibility to respond.
Yes, once you notice that a relationship needs attention, you have to decide whether to communicate. Once you notice that you want to improve a skill, you have to decide whether to practice. Once you notice that something in your life is no longer working, you have to decide what comes next.
And decisions can be uncomfortable.
They can.
But avoiding decisions also has consequences.
Exactly. Sometimes people think doing nothing means avoiding a choice, but actually, doing nothing is also a choice.
That's a powerful idea.
Every day, we are choosing something. We are choosing how to spend our time, what to focus on, what habits to build, and what relationships to maintain.
Which means small choices matter.
They do.
Maybe more than we realize.
And that is why paying attention is so important.
Because life is created through small moments.
Small conversations,
Small decisions.
small improvements,
Small acts of care.
things that may seem ordinary, but slowly shape our experience.
And when we learn to notice them, we begin to understand life differently.
We become more aware of ourselves,
More patient with others.
more confident in our abilities.
And more willing to communicate honestly.
Which brings us back to the central idea.
The things we pretend not to notice are often the things that teach us the most. I think the interesting thing about awareness is that it often begins with very simple moments. It doesn't always require a dramatic life change or a major decision. Sometimes it starts with noticing a small feeling, a small habit, or a small interaction that we usually ignore.
Yes, a lot of people imagine that personal growth has to look dramatic. They think one day they will suddenly become a completely different person. But most growth happens quietly. It happens when someone chooses to respond differently in a familiar situation.
For example, someone who used to avoid speaking English because they were afraid of mistakes decides to say one sentence anyway.
That one sentence may seem small, but it represents something much bigger. It represents courage. It represents a willingness to be uncomfortable for the sake of growth.
And the same thing happens in relationships. Someone who usually keeps their feelings inside decides to have an honest conversation.
That conversation may not solve everything immediately, but it creates a possibility for understanding.
Which is something that would not exist if the person continued staying silent.
Exactly. Sometimes the first step is not about creating a perfect result. It is about opening a door.
I think many people underestimate the importance of opening doors.
Yes, they want guarantees before they begin. They want to know the exact outcome before they take action.
But most meaningful experiences don't come with guarantees.
Number learning, relationships, careers, and personal growth all involve uncertainty.
And maybe becoming comfortable with uncertainty is one of the most valuable skills we can develop.
I agree, because uncertainty is not something we can eliminate. It is something we learn to manage.
That is a very different mindset.
Yes, instead of asking, how can I create a life where nothing unexpected happens? We can ask, how can I become someone who can handle unexpected things?
That's a much stronger question.
Because the first question focuses on controlling the world, which is impossible. The second question focuses on developing ourselves, which is possible.
And that connects with confidence again.
Exactly. Confidence is not believing that everything will always go well. Confidence is believing that you can respond when things don't go perfectly.
You can make mistakes.
You can learn.
You can adjust.
You can continue.
I think that is one of the biggest differences between people who grow and people who stay stuck. It is not that one group never experiences difficulty. Everyone does.
The difference is often how they respond to difficulty.
Some people see challenges as evidence that they should stop.
Others see challenges as information.
They ask, what can I learn from this?
Exactly. A mistake becomes feedback. A difficult conversation becomes an opportunity for understanding. A failure becomes a lesson.
That doesn't mean failure feels good.
No, of course not. Failure can still be painful.
But pain and growth can exist together.
Absolutely.
I think people sometimes avoid trying because they want to avoid the feeling of failure.
Yes, but avoiding failure also means avoiding many opportunities.
Because every success usually includes previous attempts that didn't work.
Exactly. People often see success as the final result, not the collection of experiences that created it.
And those experiences include mistakes,
Confusion.
uncertainty,
Restarting.
trying again.
Those parts are not signs that something is wrong. They are part of the process.
I think this is an especially valuable lesson for anyone learning a language.
Definitely. Language learning requires repeated exposure to situations where you are not completely comfortable.
You listen to something and understand only half.
You speak and search for words.
You make a grammar mistake.
You misunderstand someone's meaning.
But every one of those moments teaches you something.
Exactly. The learner who accepts those moments usually improves faster than the learner who tries to avoid them completely.
Because they spend more time actually using the language.
Yes, language is not only something you study, it is something you experience.
Through conversations.
Through stories.
Through mistakes.
Through connection.
And maybe that is why communication is such a human experience.
Because communication is never only about information.
It is about people.
Their backgrounds.
Their emotions.
Their memories.
Their hopes.
Their fears.
Every conversation is an opportunity to understand another person a little better.
And every conversation is also an opportunity to understand ourselves.
Because when we explain our thoughts, we often discover what we truly believe.
That's a great point. Sometimes we don't fully understand our own feelings until we try to express them.
Speaking creates clarity.
Yes, writing can do the same thing. Reflection can do the same thing.
Any process that helps us slow down and organize our thoughts can reveal things we normally overlook.
And maybe that is why slowing down is so important.
Because when life moves too quickly, we often only react.
We respond to messages,
Complete tasks.
solve problems,
Move to the next thing.
but we don't always ask why we are doing what we are doing.
Or whether it still matters to us.
Exactly.
So perhaps one of the most valuable habits is creating moments where we stop and pay attention.
A few minutes of reflection.
A meaningful conversation.
A quiet walk.
A moment without constant distraction.
These moments allow us to notice what daily life hides.
And what we notice can change our decisions.
I think there is also something beautiful about noticing other people.
What do you mean?
I mean recognizing that everyone around us is carrying a story. The person sitting next to us, the colleague we talk to, the stranger we pass on the street. Everyone has experiences we know nothing about.
That's true.
Someone may be dealing with a difficult situation while still being kind to others. Someone may be struggling with confidence while appearing successful. Someone may be learning something new and feeling uncertain, just like we do.
Remembering that can make us more patient.
Yes, it reminds us not to judge too quickly.
Because we usually see only a small part of someone's life.
Exactly. A person's behavior is often connected to experiences we cannot see.
And that doesn't mean we excuse everything.
Right? Understanding someone does not mean accepting every action. It simply means recognizing that people are more complex than a single moment.
That's an important communication skill.
It is, because better communication starts with better understanding.
And better understanding starts with curiosity.
Instead of immediately asking, why is this person like that? We can ask, what might be happening here?
That small change in thinking can completely change our interactions.
It can create more empathy,
More patience,
more meaningful conversations.
and maybe a more connected world.
I think that is ultimately what this topic comes down to. The things we pretend not to notice are often connected to our deepest human experiences.
The desire to be understood.
The fear of failure.
The need for connection.
The challenge of change.
The importance of growth.
The value of paying attention.
All of these things exist quietly in everyday life.
And when we begin noticing them, we begin living more intentionally.
Not perfectly,
Not without problems.
but with more awareness.
And maybe that is enough. When we look back at everything we have discussed, I think the most important idea is that noticing something does not mean we have to immediately fix everything. Sometimes people avoid awareness because they believe that once they recognize a problem, they must completely change their lives overnight.
That's true, they think awareness creates pressure. They think, if I admit this is a problem, then I need to solve it immediately. But real change usually does not happen that way.
Exactly. Awareness is the beginning of a process. It gives us information. It helps us understand ourselves better, but change can happen gradually through small choices and consistent effort.
I think that is a comforting idea because many people feel overwhelmed by personal growth. They look at everything they want to improve and feel like they have too much to do.
Yes, they see all their weaknesses at once. They think about every mistake, every missed opportunity, and every area where they want to become better.
And that can make people feel stuck.
Exactly. But growth is not about becoming a completely different person. It is about becoming more aware of the person you already are and developing your abilities step by step.
That's a much healthier way to think about improvement.
Yes, you don't need to reject who you are today in order to become better tomorrow.
You can appreciate your current self while still working toward growth.
Exactly, those two things can exist together.
I think many language learners need to hear this. Sometimes they believe they have to become a different person to speak English well.
Yes, they think they need to lose their accent, change their personality, or imitate someone else completely.
But that is not the purpose of learning a language.
Right, the purpose is to communicate more freely. Your experiences, your culture, and your personality are valuable parts of your voice.
A language gives you another way to share yourself.
Exactly, it does not erase your identity, it expands it.
That's a beautiful way to describe learning.
And I think the same idea applies to communication in general. Good communication is not about becoming someone who always says the perfect thing.
It is about becoming someone who is willing to connect.
Yes, someone who listens.
Someone who stays curious.
Someone who is patient with differences.
Someone who is willing to admit mistakes.
Someone who understands that every person has a story.
And every conversation is an opportunity to learn something.
I think one of the biggest changes people can make is becoming more interested than judgmental.
That's an interesting contrast.
Yes, when something happens, we often judge first. We decide whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, normal or strange.
But curiosity creates another possibility.
Exactly. Curiosity asks questions. It creates understanding before conclusions.
And that skill is incredibly valuable in today's world.
Because people are constantly interacting with different opinions, cultures, and experiences.
The ability to listen and understand has become more important than ever.
Yes, especially because communication is not becoming simpler. The world is becoming more connected, but connection requires effort.
Technology can help us communicate faster.
But it cannot automatically help us understand each other better.
That still requires human skills.
Attention,
Empathy,
patience,
curiosity.
and the willingness to notice what is not immediately obvious.
I think that might be the final lesson from this conversation.
What we notice shapes how we live.
If we notice only problems, life can feel overwhelming.
If we notice only achievements, we may ignore what truly matters.
If we notice only ourselves, we may miss other people's experiences.
But if we learn to notice more carefully, we create a more balanced understanding of life.
We can recognize challenges without being controlled by them.
We can appreciate progress without becoming comfortable with staying the same.
We can care about others while also taking care of ourselves.
And we can continue learning without expecting perfection.
I think that is a lifelong skill.
It really is.
Because there will always be things we don't understand yet.
There will always be new challenges,
New conversations.
new opportunities.
New versions of ourselves waiting to be discovered.
And maybe that is what makes life interesting.
The fact that we are always learning.
Always changing.
Always discovering something new.
Sometimes the most important discoveries are not outside of us.
They are inside us.
A fear we finally understand.
A strength we never noticed.
A dream we ignored.
A relationship we want to improve.
A skill we want to develop.
A conversation we need to have.
These moments may seem small,
But small moments create meaningful changes.
and meaningful changes create the life we experience.
So maybe the next time we notice something we usually avoid, we can ask ourselves a different question.
Instead of asking, how can I ignore this?
We can ask, what can this teach me?
Because every feeling, every challenge, and every experience carries information.
And when we are willing to listen, we understand ourselves and others more deeply.
Thank you for spending this time with us and exploring these ideas about communication, learning, and personal growth.
We hope this conversation reminds you that becoming a better communicator is not only about learning more words or improving your speaking skills.
It is about becoming more aware, more curious, and more connected with the people around you.
Every conversation is a chance to learn.
Every mistake is a chance to improve.
Every moment of awareness is a chance to grow.
And sometimes the things we almost ignore are the things that can teach us the most.
Because when we slow down and truly notice, we don't just understand the world better.
We understand ourselves better.
And that understanding is where meaningful communication begins.